Hi there, my name is Monica Mueller and I teach philosophy at Portland State University. Today I'd like to give you a brief presentation on some elements of deontological ethics in hopes that they might help you as you are preparing your cases for the Ethics Bowl. So deontology is quite literally the study of duty or obligation. It comes from the Greek word deon, meaning right or obligation. And so often deontology is concerned with the rationality of moral obligations. Now, sometimes we see this in forms that are considered rule-based ethics, because ethical rules and guidelines entail obligations that one is required to obey. Religious deontology, for example, prescribes a list of rules based on divine law, and the Ten Commandments, for example, would meet that description. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is also considered a deontological list of guidelines about what one must do or not do or interfere with in order to respect the dignity of humans as persons. So deontology is frequently concerned with rules or principles of action. However, the basis for these rules or guidelines is based on a deductive reasoning process that a rational agent can determine for oneself independent of the list of rules themselves. Deontological theories hold that the rightness of an action depends on factors other than the consequences of the action. These include such things as whether the intentions with which the act is done were good or pure or moral or reasonable, whether the action itself is just, whether it respects the rights of those affected by it, whether the action is consistent with the demands of duty, and whether, whatever its consequences, something in the nature of the action itself makes it intrinsically wrong. Duties are things that we recognize as being required of us, irrespective of what we want to do or what we really desire to do. Some deontological theories specify differences in kinds of duties based on the necessity of acting in accordance with the duty in question. Kant, for example, distinguishes between perfect duties and imperfect duties, and perfect duties take precedence over imperfect. A perfect duty is one which one must always do, and an imperfect duty is a duty which one must not ignore, but admits of multiple means of fulfillment. An example of a perfect duty is to never break a promise. Kant develops his reasoning for the duty to never break promises based on the categorical imperative, which in one of its formulations is roughly to act in such a way that your reason for action or your principle for action, which he calls a maxim, could become a universal law of nature. So as a thought experiment, if we imagined a world in which persons universally broke promises, the meaning of promises would break down. No one would believe a promise, and therefore we would not be able to succeed in making and keeping promises or in breaking promises. Hence, the maxim to break promises whenever it is conducive to your interest could not hold as universal law. It would be self-contradictory. In order for one's intent to break promises whenever one felt compelled to do so requires that the institution of promise keeping remain intact. So one way to think about it is if you require everyone else to follow a rule in order to make an exception to that rule for oneself, that doesn't make any sense. The point is not the imagining of future states of affairs, as in consequential theories, but rather the reasoning that leads to self-contradiction. In this case, the contradiction that results in the very notion of promise keeping when one's intent is to break it. An example of an imperfect duty that Kant develops is the duty to develop one's talents. For this argument, Kant explains that there's no logical contradiction that results from universalizing the maxim to neglect the development of one's talents. Similarly, Kant argues that there's an imperfect duty to help others when one can. Again, the reasoning here is that there's no logical contradiction that develops when we imagine a world in which no one ever helps anyone else. Yet it would still be reasonable to help others. So we have an imperfect duty to help when we can. We can't ignore it, but it doesn't reach the status of perfect duties, as in the case of the contradiction that results from keeping promises. Now, the status of this particular duty is hotly debated, particularly from a feminist care ethics perspective, especially when we consider the necessity to help infants for their survival. Were there never care for the young, it's hard to imagine survival. It's hard to imagine a world where that is logically possible. So feminists and care ethicists might argue that there's actually a perfect duty to care for infants, for example. Nevertheless, for Kant and for some deontologists, the duty to help others is considered a good thing to do, but it is not required given the circumstances. Nevertheless, this leads to the possibility of considering what deontologists will call special obligations and special permissions. Based on what's been said so far, there are certain relationships that involve special obligations and permissions. And for example, if one has made a promise of monogamous fidelity, say through a marriage contract, one establishes a special obligation to care for one's partner in sickness and in health till death. And this entails a special obligation to help one's partner in sickness. And given that there's a perfect duty to keep one's promises, but an imperfect duty to help others when one can, in a concrete scenario, it would be reasonable to help one's spouse in sickness rather than to help a stranger in sickness. There are also special permissions that may result from this promise. For example, the permission to violate one's bodily autonomy, for example, when choosing to procreate in agreement with one's marriage contract. Now, all of this is subject to nuance and debate, but I choose these examples so that you see that from a deontological perspective, based on commitments, based on obligations in promise keeping, we have new special obligations and permissions that result. Agent-centered deontology follows from the recognition of the inherent worth or dignity of persons. What is considered the basis of personhood itself is subject to debate, but Kant offers a formulation of personhood that is intrinsically valuable because of a person's ability to reason and ability to act in accordance with one's reasoning capacity. Furthermore, Kant's articulation of autonomy is based on a person's ability to choose to act in a way that is consistent with rational law and her willingness to do so. So, respecting the dignity of personhood establishes certain imperatives or principles that are translated into practical terms, and some of these imperatives are inviolable regardless of circumstances. Indeed, respect for personhood is frequently argued to be the basis of a rights-based system of ethical obligations and prohibitions. When we discuss rights, we simultaneously establish a set of duties that correspond to those rights. If a person has a right to their body, there's a corresponding duty established for every other person to not violate another person's body. Deontological arguments, therefore, refrain from discussing the consequences of one's action. Instead, they focus on the principles for action and the duties and obligations involved in respecting personhood and autonomy. Supererogatory acts are the final kind of notion that develops from a deontological framework that I want to discuss. A supererogatory act, by definition, is an act that goes above and beyond one's duty. These are things that it would be good to do, but not morally wrong not to do. This is a clear distinction between deontological approaches to ethics and consequentialist approaches to ethics. If a consequentialist determines that an action will bring forth the best consequences, one is required to do so. Deontologists think that there are some actions that it would be good to do, but not required. So one could choose to offer funds to charity if one chooses, but there's no necessary obligation to help those in need. So this brings us to the case that I wanted to bring up for the example of the ethics bowl. From the 2019-20 regional cases, I've selected number 11, billionaire backfire. Now, this is the case where there's a question of whether or not philanthropists are required to give money to help those who are suffering rather than to give money to refurbish the Notre Dame Cathedral. So the question for reflection is, when is someone morally praiseworthy for donating money to a charitable cause, and what makes it praiseworthy when it is? A deontologist might argue that charity, by definition, is a supererogatory act. In fact, it's voluntary. If everyone were required to give, there'd be no such thing as charity. Therefore, the requirement to give to charity is contradictory and is unreasonable. Choosing to give aid, however, is a good thing to do. It's not required. Leaving the decision to give to the rational agent about whom to give promotes the autonomy of persons to determine their own course of extending goodwill. The second reflection question is, how does one compare the value of artistic, cultural, historical artifacts versus the value of human life and well-being? Well, from a deontological perspective, it could be argued that respecting autonomy of individual agents to choose where to dispense with their own earnings is valuing human life and well-being. Thank you.